Well, to talk more about that, we're joined now by our international affairs correspondent, Batya Levintal. She's in northern Israel, close to the border with Lebanon. So, Batya, we know that Amos Hochstein has now left Beirut. What is the likelihood, though, of an agreement?
Right, well, just before touching on that, I want to give the viewers a sense of just how close we are to that border. We're about 9 kilometers or 6 miles south of the Lebanon border. In terms of how likely it is an agreement will be reached, it was quite surprising that it wasn't this time around and that Hochstein left without reaching such an accord. Both sides seem to be putting out messages of optimism, saying that the latest rounds of negotiation could possibly bear some fruit. But again, he is likely leaving the region without such a negotiation and set to return. As Mary McAuliffe mentioned, it's the second visit of the U.S. energy envoy in less than 2 months, so it's likely that these visits will continue until something in the status quo changes and a negotiation has finally come to fruition.
And as we saw in that report, Batya, Hezbollah has been ramping up the threats towards Israel in recent weeks. How can we interpret those threats? Is the group perhaps worried that an agreement on this issue could lead to other agreements and even potentially normalization?
It's an interesting question, Laura, and it seems that from the Israeli perspective, they don't seem so concerned. The Israel energy minister actually putting out a statement today to say that Israel is dealing with the Lebanese government and no other parties with regards to the negotiations on the energy fields. In terms of Lebanon, it seems like they have a choice to make as to how involved they really want Lebanon as Hezbollah, as we know that the organization really has very deep ties within the government, and how involved they want them to be in such a decision. You have to understand that if the Karish field does end up being fully in Israel's territory and sovereignty, it means that Hezbollah doesn't have a viable excuse anymore in order to launch attacks on the region, although it can continue to do so in the disputed waters just north of the Karish field. But in terms of taking their threats seriously, as mentioned in the report, Israel did shoot down 3 of those drones that actually ended up coming towards its territory, 1 through the air and 1 via 2 ships that were at sea. And so very much so taking these threats seriously, as this could be a very good potential for Israel to start exporting some of that natural gas that it's found to European partners, which would be a first and one that takes them away from depending on Russian oil and gas.
And Batya, what about inside Lebanon? What about public opinion? Do most people favour a deal with Israel? Are they dead against it? Because it could potentially release a lot of revenue for this struggling nation, couldn't it?
Right, and 2 separate issues indeed. One being that this likely holds a lot of advantages and benefits for both sides, including the United States, as I mentioned, would take them away from dependence on Russian oil and gas. But in terms of both sides, the benefits are quite clear. Lebanon has been embroiled in a terrible economic downfall for years now, and the ability to restart its economy would really rely heavily on having the ability to then go drilling offshore in the fields that lie just off its coast. But in terms of normalization, again, because the 2 countries are adversaries and still technically at war, have not signing any kind of peace deal between the 2 of them, this really is a drop in the ocean in terms of a win for potentially both sides. But an overall normalization agreement doesn't seem likely. In terms of the Lebanese people, it is not the same situation as Iran, where it's the regime that ends up being quite against Israel and its population, and the people not so much. In Lebanon, we are seeing quite a lot of resentment from the people themselves, given recent escalations as well as the past Lebanese-Israel war. But for the time being, it's no doubt a win for both sides. Both sides need the win. An agreement needs to be reached. It just depends how far both sides are willing to compromise in order to reach one.
Batya, thank you very much indeed. Batya Levintal there in northern Israel.